Julian was the kind of man who believed that perfection was the only thing that mattered in life. He was a pianist, and not just any pianist, but a man who had spent years in the best schools learning exactly how to hit every key with the right amount of force. He didn't play music, he attacked it. He sat on the bench in the middle of the grand hotel lobby, his back perfectly straight, his fingers moving so fast they looked like a blur of white light. The piano was a massive, shiny black beast of a machine, and Julian controlled it completely. The sound that filled the lobby was loud and complicated. It was a piece of music that was designed to show off how difficult playing the piano could be. Notes crashed together like waves in a storm, then suddenly stopped for a fraction of a second before rushing up the scale again. To the people walking through the lobby with their suitcases and their coffees, it sounded impressive. They stopped to stare. They pulled out their phones to record videos of the man in the sharp suit making the piano sing. Julian knew they were watching. He didn't look at them, but he could feel their eyes on him. He enjoyed it. He wanted them to see that he was better than the noise of the busy city outside. He wanted them to see that he was an artist. When he finished the song, he didn't just lift his hands. He flung them up dramatically, letting the last heavy chord hang in the air. He turned his head slightly, waiting for the applause. It came immediately. A scattering of claps and a few bravos from the tourists. Julian gave a small, tight nod. He accepted the praise as if it was his due, like paying a tax. He was about to start another song, something even faster and louder, when he noticed someone standing near the grand marble pillar to his left. It was a woman. She wasn't wearing a suit or a fancy dress. She wore the uniform of the hotel cleaning staff. It was a dark dress with a white apron tied around her waist, and practical black shoes that looked like they had walked a million miles. She was older than him, her hair pulled back tightly in a way that looked practical rather than stylish. In her hand, she held a feather duster. She wasn't looking at her phone or whispering to a friend. She was looking directly at the piano. Her head was tilted just a little to the side, and her eyes were closed. She wasn't clapping. She was just listening. Julian felt a sudden spark of irritation. He didn't know why, but it bothered him that this woman, who cleaned floors for a living, was standing there analyzing his performance. He felt that she didn't have the education to understand what he was doing. To him, music was a club for the elite, and this woman was standing outside the club looking in. He decided to play something even harder, a piece that required jumps so wide he almost had to stand up. He attacked the keys, banging out the notes with harsh precision. He expected her to walk away, intimidated by the noise, but she didn't move. She swayed slightly, her lips moving silently as if she were humming along with the melody. She seemed to be hearing something different than what he was playing. She looked peaceful, which made Julian even angrier. He wasn't playing to be peaceful, he was playing to be worshipped. He slammed his hands down on the final chords, harder than necessary, causing a few people nearby to jump. He lifted his hands off the keys and let the silence rush back into the lobby. He turned on the bench to face the woman directly. He stared at her, waiting for her to notice his glare. The woman opened her eyes slowly. The look on her face was soft, almost dreamy. She looked at Julian, and for a second, she smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind that wrinkles the corners of the eyes. It was a smile that said, "Thank you for that." Julian did not smile back. He looked her up and down, taking in the cleaning apron and the worn shoes. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and spoke in a loud, clear voice so that the people nearby could hear him. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with a cold sort of politeness, watching isn't the same as understanding. The woman looked confused. She shifted her weight, holding the duster with both hands. "I'm sorry," she asked. Her voice was quiet, with a scratch to it like dry leaves. Julian tilted his chin up. "Music," he said, tapping his chest with his fingers, "is a language of the intellect. It requires years of training to truly grasp what is happening. It is mathematics. It is architecture." He gestured toward the piano. "What I just played was a structure built of history and theory. To someone who doesn't know the code, it just sounds like noise. Or, I suppose, a nice tune." A few of the tourists stopped whispering. The air in the lobby felt suddenly heavy. The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of uncertainty. She looked down at her shoes. I just liked the sound," she said softly. "It reminded me of a garden in spring." Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. A garden! It was a study in chaos and order. He shook his head, looking at the ceiling as if asking for patience. "That is exactly what I mean. You hear the pretty notes, but you miss the point. It is like a child looking at a blueprint and seeing only a drawing of lines, while an architect sees a building." He turned back to the piano and ran his fingers over the cool ivory keys without pressing them down. "This instrument is not for amusement," he said, his back to her now. "It is for mastery. It is disrespectful to the art to treat it like background noise for your cleaning." The silence stretched out. It was an awkward, painful silence. A man holding a cup of coffee turned away, pretending to look out the glass revolving doors at the street. Someone else cleared their throat loudly. Julian waited for the woman to argue. He wanted her to defend herself so he could prove, with his superior vocabulary, why he was right. But she didn't argue. She didn't get angry. She just stood there for a moment longer. Julian heard the rustle of her apron as she moved. He thought she was leaving, but instead, she stepped closer to the piano. She reached out a hand. Her hand was rough, with red knuckles and short, clipped nails. She stopped just inches from the wood of the piano, as if she wanted to touch it but remembered that she wasn't allowed. She pulled her hand back. "It is beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. "It has a voice, doesn't it, even when you aren't playing?" Julian spun around. "It is wood and wire," he snapped, losing his cool demeanor. "It has no voice. I give it a voice. Without a master, it is just a piece of furniture." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were sad, but they were also steady. She didn't look offended, she looked sorry for him. It was a look that pierced through Julian's arrogance more than any insult could have. She saw that he was a man who knew everything about the mechanics of the piano but nothing about its soul. "You have very fast hands," she said gently. "I hope one day they learn to slow down enough to hear what the piano is trying to say back to you." Before Julian could think of a cutting response, she turned and walked away. She didn't storm off. She walked at her normal working pace, pushing her cart toward the service elevators at the back of the lobby. The wheels of the cart squeaked slightly on the marble floor, a high-pitched, rhythmic squeak. Julian sat there on the bench, his heart hammering in his chest, not from the exercise of playing, but from the confrontation. He felt a strange mix of triumph and shame. He had told her off. He had put her in her place. But why did he feel so small? He looked at the keys in front of him. They were just pieces of ivory and ebony. He pressed a key, then let it go. The sound rang out, clear and perfect. A single note. He pressed another. A chord. It sounded technically correct. It sounded exactly like it was supposed to sound. But for some reason, as he sat there in the middle of the expensive lobby with his tailored suit and his prestigious education, the piano sounded a little bit like a piece of furniture. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind of the woman's face. He arranged his music sheets, smoothing out the corners with sharp, precise movements. He was the master here. He was the professional. She was just a cleaner who didn't know a sonata from a soup spoon. He lifted his hands again, his fingers curled and ready. He began to play. The music filled the lobby again, loud and fast and impressive, but as he played, he found himself listening to the squeak of the cleaning cart disappearing into the distance, and for the first time in years, he couldn't find the rhythm. A whole week passed before Julian found himself in that specific part of the hotel again. Usually, he stuck to the main lobby where the crowds were, but today the main ballroom was being set up for a large wedding. The noise of the construction crew and the clanging of metal chairs made it impossible for him to practice his new piece. He needed quiet. He needed absolute focus. He grabbed his sheet music and headed toward the lounge area near the back of the hotel. It was a quieter spot, usually reserved for guests who wanted to read or drink coffee in peace. It had thick carpet that absorbed sound and high walls filled with old paintings. Tucked away in the far corner of this room, almost hidden behind a tall rubber plant, was an older upright piano. It wasn't a grand Steinway like the one in the lobby. It was smaller, the wood was a darker mahogany, and the ivory on the keys was yellowed with age. Julian looked down at it with a wrinkled nose. It was clearly an instrument for guests to mess around on, not for a serious artist. However, he had no choice. He pulled out the bench, sat down, and placed his music on the rack. The piece he was working on was complex. It was full of fast runs and tricky rhythms. Julian knew he could play the notes, but his teacher had told him it lacked soul. Julian didn't care about soul. He cared about precision. But the competition was coming up, and the judges always looked for that emotional depth, even if Julian thought it was a silly requirement. He started to play. It was difficult. His fingers stumbled over a section where the left hand had to jump quickly. He stopped, growled in frustration, and played the same 4 measures over and over. It sounded mechanical. It sounded like a typewriter clicking away. He hit the keys harder, trying to force the emotion out of the strings. C, E, G jump. C, F, A, he muttered to himself, sweat forming on his forehead. Wrong. Again. He was so focused on his own frustration that he didn't hear the soft squeak of a service door opening down the hall. He didn't hear the quiet footsteps approaching. It wasn't until he stopped to rub his cramping hands that he heard another sound. It was a chord. A simple, deep, resonant chord that seemed to hang in the air like heavy smoke. Julian froze. He wasn't the one who played it. He slowly turned his head on his neck, careful not to make a sound. Behind the large rubber plant, sat the woman from the lobby. She wasn't in her uniform this time. She had clocked out, evidently. She was wearing a simple, loose dress made of a faded blue fabric with tiny flowers on it. Her hair was down, resting on her shoulders in soft gray waves. She looked completely different without the stiff uniform and the apron. She looked smaller, fragile almost. She was sitting on the bench of the dusty upright piano. Her posture was terrible, at least by Julian's standards. She was slumped forward, her back curved like a question mark. She didn't sit with the regal straightness that Julian did. She sat like someone who was tired, someone who was used to carrying heavy things. Julian prepared himself to be annoyed. He expected to hear a child's song, or chopsticks, or some clumsy banging that would ruin his concentration. He considered standing up and telling her this was a private area for professionals. But then, she began to play in earnest. It wasn't a famous piece. Julian didn't recognize the composer. It wasn't Liszt, it wasn't Chopin, and it wasn't Bach. It was a melody that sounded like it came from the earth itself. It was slow. She played the notes with a hesitation that was strange to Julian's ears. In the music schools, they taught you to be confident. To hit the note and mean it. But this woman, she touched the keys as if she was afraid they might burn her, or as if she was testing ice to see if it would hold her weight. The melody wove through the air. It was sad but not painful. It was the kind of sadness you feel when you look at an old photograph of a house you used to live in. Julian found himself holding his breath. Technically, her playing was flawed. Her timing wasn't perfect. Sometimes she held a note a fraction of a second too long. Sometimes her pinky finger was a little weak on the high keys. If Julian were her teacher, he would have marked her paper with red ink and circled the mistakes. He would have told her to strengthen her fingers and count the beats. But as he sat there, hidden behind the plant, he realized something terrifying. The mistakes didn't matter. The imperfect timing actually made the music sound more real. It sounded like a human voice catching in a throat. She played a phrase that climbed up the scale, hopeful and bright, and then suddenly dropped down into a low, rumbling minor key. It felt like a sudden disappointment. Julian felt a strange tightness in his chest, a physical ache right below his ribs. He looked at his own hands, resting on his lap. They were hands that could play 30 notes in a second. They were hands of speed and power. Yet, he knew that he could never make the piano sound like that. He watched her face. Her eyes were closed. Her mouth was open just a little bit. She wasn't thinking about what her fingers were doing. She wasn't counting 1 and 2 and 3 and. She was somewhere else. She was remembering something. Julian wondered what she was seeing. Was she a child again? Was she in a field? Was she holding someone's hand? The music swelled, getting a little louder. She was using the pedals, but not in the way Julian was taught. She was keeping the sustain pedal down just a touch too long, letting the notes blur together into a wash of sound. To a judge, it would be muddy. To Julian, sitting there in the quiet lounge, it sounded like the ocean. It sounded like waves overlapping on a beach. The song didn't have a dramatic ending. It just slowed down. The notes got softer and softer until they were just whispers. She played one final chord, so gently that if the room had been any noisier, it wouldn't have been heard at all. She lifted her hands off the keys and placed them in her lap. She sat there for a long time, just looking at the wood of the piano. Julian realized he was gripping the edge of his own bench so hard his knuckles were white. He let go. He felt like he had just witnessed a secret that wasn't meant for him. He felt exposed. This woman, who cleaned floors and wore simple dresses, had just played a circle around him without playing a single difficult note. She had put something into the music that Julian didn't have. She had truth. He didn't know what to do. Should he clap? Should he confront her? Should he leave? The pride that he carried around like a shield began to crack. He thought about his own performance in the lobby earlier that week. It had been loud. It had been fast. But compared to this, his music felt empty. It felt like a glass of water next to a deep, dark well. The woman sighed, a sound of deep contentment, and stood up. She smoothed the fabric of her dress. She reached out and patted the side of the old upright piano, almost like a friend on the back. Julian panicked. He didn't want her to know he had been spying. He didn't want her to see the look on his face, the look of a man who realized he might be a fraud. He quickly and quietly gathered his sheet music. He didn't close the music book, afraid the snap would give him away. He stood up on legs that felt surprisingly shaky. Just as she turned to walk toward the door, Julian slipped away, moving toward the exit on the opposite side of the room. He walked quickly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't stop until he was out in the hallway, leaning against the cool wallpaper. He looked at the closed door of the lounge. He could still hear the ghost of her melody in his ears. He looked down at his music sheets. The black notes stared back at him, arranged in complex patterns that he knew exactly how to execute. But for the first time in his life, the dots on the page looked dead. They looked like ants. Julian straightened his jacket. He tried to compose himself. He told himself he was just tired. He told himself that her playing was amateurish and emotional, and that he was a master of technique. But as he walked down the long hall back to his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just lost a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. He realized that he knew everything about the piano, except how to make it speak. And she, with her rough hands and simple dress, knew exactly what it wanted to say. The days that followed were difficult for Julian. Usually, he practiced with a clear mind, focused only on the mechanics of the music. But lately, every time he touched a key, he heard that soft, sad melody from the lounge. It was like a ghost haunting the piano. No matter how fast he played, or how perfectly he hit the notes, the music felt empty to him. It felt like he was banging on a box instead of painting a picture. The big event of the year was coming up fast. It was called the Grand Season Showcase, and it was a very serious deal. The hotel hired expensive decorators to set up the main ballroom with crystal glassware and white tablecloths. Important people from the city would be there: critics, wealthy donors, and other musicians. Julian was the star of the show. He had the final slot, the spot reserved for the most important performer. He had spent months preparing a complicated suite, a piece that was designed to make the audience gasp at his skill. On the Tuesday before the show, Julian was walking through the staff hallway to get to the kitchen to ask for some water. He passed the break room, which was a small room with a vending machine and a few plastic tables. The door was open, and the hotel manager was standing there, talking to the staff. "Okay, everyone, listen up," the manager said, clapping his hands. "For the showcase this Saturday, corporate wants us to do something new. They want to show that the hotel is a family. So, we are adding a community spotlight segment at the start of the show. 5 minutes. Any staff member who wants to perform a talent can sign up." A few of the younger staff members laughed nervously. "Sing a song," a bellboy joked. "Who would want to hear us?" The manager ignored him. "It's a chance to shine. We have one slot open. Does anyone want it?" Julian stopped in the hallway, just outside the door. He leaned against the wall, listening. He couldn't believe it. The showcase was a place for high art, for professionals. Putting a staff member on that stage was like putting a clown in a tuxedo. It was a joke. "I'll do it," a voice said from inside the room. Julian recognized the voice immediately. It was scratchy and soft. It was the woman. "Really?" the manager asked, sounding surprised. "What will you do?" "I will play the piano," she said. The room went quiet for a second. Then, a few people clapped. "That's amazing," said the girl who worked at the front desk. "I didn't know you played." Julian felt a hot flash of anger shoot up his neck. He stepped into the doorway. The room fell silent as the staff saw him standing there in his expensive clothes, holding his bottle of water. He looked at the woman, who was sitting at one of the plastic tables eating a sandwich. "Don't be ridiculous," Julian said. His voice was loud in the small room. "You can't be serious." The woman looked up at him. She didn't look angry. She just looked calm. She wiped her mouth with a napkin. "I am very serious," she said. Julian walked into the room, his shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. He looked at the other staff members, then back at her. "This is a professional event. The audience pays good money to see high-level performance. They come to see me. They come to hear mastery. They don't want to watch an amateur stumble through a song. It lowers the value of the entire evening." The manager looked uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Well, she is allowed to sign up, Julian. It is hotel policy to include staff." "It's a mistake," Julian snapped. "Music is not a hobby. It is a discipline. It takes decades to learn how to stand on that stage. You can't just walk up there after cleaning toilets all day and expect to be an artist." A few of the staff members looked down at the table. They were embarrassed by his harsh words, but no one dared to say anything to the hotel's star performer. The woman slowly stood up. She was not a tall woman, and Julian towered over her, but she didn't back down. She met his eyes. "I have been playing since I was a little girl," she said quietly. "Longer than you have been alive, perhaps. Music isn't about who has the better suit or who gets paid the most. It is about what is inside." Julian let out a short, cruel laugh. "Inside, please. You probably play by ear. You probably don't even know how to read a treble clef. You play for fun. That is fine for a Sunday afternoon in the park. But on a stage in front of critics you will be laughed at. And you will make this hotel look foolish." He stepped closer, trying to intimidate her. "Do you really think you can compare yourself to me? I have practiced 8 hours a day for 20 years. My hands are insured for a fortune. What are you going to do, play a nursery rhyme?" The woman's eyes hardened. They weren't sad anymore. They were fierce. "I am going to play the truth," she said. "Something you seem to have forgotten a long time ago." "Fine," Julian said, throwing his hands up. "You want to humiliate yourself, go ahead. But let's call it what it is. A challenge." The manager frowned. "Julian, please, there is no need." "No, no," Julian interrupted, a smirk forming on his face. "I accept. I will play right after you. I will show the audience what a piano should sound like. And then, when they see the difference between my perfection and your simple little song, they will understand why some people are musicians and others are just listeners." He turned to leave, feeling a surge of satisfaction. He thought he had won. He thought he had scared her off. "I will see you on Saturday," Julian said over his shoulder. "Saturday," the woman replied. Her voice was steady. As Julian walked back to his room, his confidence began to waver. He replayed the conversation in his head. He had been mean, certainly, but he had also been right. Hadn't he? He was the professional. She was the cleaner. The order of the world was correct, yet, the way she had looked at him like he was a child throwing a tantrum stuck in his mind. He went to his piano and sat down. He played the most difficult section of his suite, over and over again. He played it perfectly. Every note was in its place. He tried to lose himself in the complexity of it, to let the math of the music soothe him. But then, an image popped into his head. He saw her sitting at the old upright piano, her hands hovering over the keys, playing that simple, haunting melody that made him feel something he couldn't name. He remembered the feeling of the air in the room changing when she played. Julian hit a wrong note. He stopped. He stared at his hands. These were the hands of a master. They were fast and strong. Why did they suddenly feel clumsy? He stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the city below. People were walking, cars were driving. Everything was moving. He felt like he was standing still while the world rushed past him. He realized with a jolt of fear that the public might not care about his speed. They might not care about his perfect timing. If she plays with heart, Julian whispered to the glass, and I play with my hands, who will they listen to? He shook his head, trying to clear the thought. He was Julian the Great. He was the technician. He was the best. He didn't need heart. He had skill. Skill was what mattered. Skill was what paid the bills. But deep down, in a pit of his stomach that he usually ignored, he knew he was lying. He knew that on Saturday night, it wouldn't be a contest of technique. It would be a contest of souls. And for the first time in his life, he was terrified that he was the one who had nothing to say. The night of the grand showcase arrived, turning the hotel into a palace of light and sound. The main ballroom was filled with long tables covered in white silk, shining silverware, and glass vases filled with white roses. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted garlic. The most important people in the city were their wealthy donors, local politicians, and serious critics who held the power to make or destroy a reputation. Julian stood in the wings, the heavy curtains brushing against his shoulder. He looked immaculate in his tuxedo. His black hair was slicked back, and he felt the familiar cold knot of nerves in his stomach, but he pushed it down. He knew how to perform. He had done this 100 times. He looked out at the crowd and saw them whispering and laughing. He was the king of this room. But his eyes kept drifting to the front row, center aisle. There sat the woman. She wasn't in her uniform tonight. She wore the same simple blue floral dress he had seen her in before, but she had added a small string of white pearls around her neck. She looked out of place among the jewels and fur coats, like a wildflower growing in a marble pavement. Next to her sat a young man, perhaps 30 years old, with kind eyes and rough hands. He held her hand tightly. The hotel manager walked onto the stage to a burst of polite applause. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone. "Thank you for being here. Tonight, we have a very special treat. We start our evening with a member of our own hotel family. Please welcome, from our housekeeping staff, she wishes to remain anonymous, but please give her a warm welcome." The applause was scattered and confused. People weren't sure what to expect. A member of the cleaning staff. They shifted in their seats, sipping their wine and murmuring to their neighbors. Julian smirked in the shadows. He saw the doubt on their faces. They expected a joke. The woman walked out from the side of the stage. She looked smaller under the bright spotlights. She didn't wave or bow to the crowd. She simply walked to the massive black Steinway piano in the center of the stage. She sat on the bench and adjusted the height. She seemed to take a moment to gather herself, closing her eyes and inhaling deeply. Julian crossed his arms. He was ready to cringe. He expected her to play poorly, to hit wrong notes and stumble through a simple nursery rhyme. He wanted her to fail so that his perfection would shine even brighter by comparison. She placed her hands on the keys. She didn't strike them. She rested them there, like she was greeting an old friend. Then, she began to play. The room went completely silent instantly. It wasn't a loud silence, it was a shocked silence. The sound that came out of the piano was not a performance. It was a confession. She played the same folk melody Julian had heard in the lounge, but this time, it was stronger. It wasn't just sad, it was powerful. She played of long days and hard work. She played of sweeping floors and standing on tired feet. She played of the loneliness of coming home to an empty house. The melody twisted and turned, rising up like a bird trying to fly against a strong wind. It was imperfect. Her timing dragged in places, rushing in others. But the emotion was so thick in the air that you could almost touch it. The critics in the front row stopped whispering. They put down their pens. The wealthy guests stopped sipping their wine. They stared at the small woman in the simple dress. For the first time that night, they weren't judging the music. They were feeling it. They were thinking of their own mothers, their own hardships, the things they had lost. Julian felt his smirk slide off his face. His arms dropped to his sides. He stood frozen in the wings. The sound of her playing was cutting through him like a knife. It was so raw, so honest. He had spent his entire life trying to build walls around his music, making it perfect and untouchable. She was tearing those walls down with a few simple chords. Then, it happened. In the middle of a complex run, her left hand faltered. She hit a discordant note, a sharp, ugly sound that crashed into the beautiful melody. It was a mistake. A terrible, obvious mistake. Julian's heart jumped. He waited for the spell to break. He waited for the audience to gasp or to look at each other and laugh. This was it. This was the moment she would fail. But the woman did not stop. She did not flinch. She did not apologize. She let the wrong note hang in the air for a beat, ringing out clearly. It sounded like a sob. Then, she slowly brought her right hand down to resolve it. She turned the mistake into part of the song. She used that ugly sound to make the beauty that followed even sweeter. It sounded like forgiveness. It sounded like the pain of living a hard life and accepting it. The audience let out a collective breath. It wasn't a breath of judgment, it was a breath of understanding. They realized that life wasn't about being perfect. It was about how you handled the wrong notes. She played the final chord. It was soft and gentle, fading away into nothingness. She lifted her hands from the keys and sat still. The silence that followed was heavy. No one moved. No one spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then, the young man in the front row, her son, stood up. He began to clap. Slowly at first, then wildly. One by one, the rest of the room rose to their feet. The applause didn't just start, it exploded. It was a roar of genuine emotion, not the polite clapping for rich people. They were clapping for her courage, for her truth, for the piece of her soul she had just given them. The woman stood up. She looked surprised by the reaction. She gave a small, awkward bow and hurried off the stage, passing Julian in the wings. She was sweating, and her face was flushed, but her eyes were bright. She looked at Julian as she passed him. She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't look arrogant. She just smiled, that same soft, knowing smile she had given him in the lobby a week ago. It was a smile that said, "Did you hear it? The lights dimmed for a moment as the crew reset the stage. Then, the announcer's voice boomed again. And now, for our main event, the internationally acclaimed Julian. The crowd clapped again, but it was different this time. It was polite, respectful, but it lacked the wild energy they had given to the woman. Julian walked out onto the stage. The lights felt hotter than before. The piano looked massive and intimidating. He sat down on the bench. He felt like his hands were made of lead. He looked out at the audience, but all he could see was the ghost of her melody hanging in the air. He placed his hands on the keys. He took a deep breath. He attacked. He played his piece. It was the same complicated, fast suite he had practiced for months. His fingers flew across the keys with blinding speed. It was perfect. Every note was exactly where it was supposed to be. The rhythm was like a machine. But as he played, Julian felt a strange hollowness opening up inside him. The music sounded thin. It sounded like glass breaking compared to the deep earth of the woman's song. He was playing notes, but she had played feelings. He was showing off his hands, but she had shown her heart. He hit the final chords with a thunderous crash. He stood up and bowed, his face red and sweaty. The audience clapped. They shouted bravo. They appreciated the skill. They knew he was talented. But as Julian walked off the stage, back into the safety of the curtains, he didn't feel like a winner. He felt like a man who had just built a beautiful house but forgot to put a door in it. He walked past the spot where the woman stood, surrounded by staff members patting her on the back, congratulating her. He looked at his own hands, the hands that were supposed to be the best in the world. They were shaking, just a little bit. He had won the technical duel, but he knew, with a terrible certainty in his gut, that he had lost the war. The chaos backstage was loud and confusing. People were rushing around with cable cases and microphones, shouting instructions over the noise of the audience leaving their seats. But Julian stood frozen in a narrow hallway near the curtains, his back against the wall. The adrenaline of his performance was fading fast, leaving him cold and empty. He could hear the polite applause from the lobby as people filed out, chatting about dinner and drinks. They were already forgetting his music. He looked down at his hands. They were the same hands he had looked at 1,000 times, pale, long-fingered, perfectly manicured. They had just played a flawless concerto. They had executed every jump, every trill, every dynamic shift exactly as the composer had written it. So why did he feel like a fraud? Why did his perfect performance feel like a lie next to the raw, broken beauty of what the woman had done? He watched her from the shadows. She was standing near a service exit, talking to her son. She was holding her shawl, her face tired but happy. She didn't look like a star. She looked like a mother who was relieved it was over. She looked like a worker who was ready to go home. Yet, she had just held the entire room in the palm of her hand. Julian knew he should leave. He should go to the VIP lounge, accept the compliments of the hotel manager, and drink champagne. That was what Julian the Great did. But his feet wouldn't move. He felt a desperate need to understand. He needed to know how she did it. He needed to know the secret she had that he didn't. He pushed himself off the wall and walked toward her. His footsteps were heavy on the carpet. As he approached, her son noticed him first. The young man's eyes went wide, and he stepped back slightly, pulling his mother's arm as if to protect her. The woman turned around. When she saw Julian, her expression didn't change. She didn't look fearful, and she didn't look impressed. She just waited. Julian stopped a few feet away from them. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He felt ridiculous in his tuxedo, standing there in the dim light of the service corridor. He felt like a peacock trying to talk to a sparrow. "How?" Julian finally whispered. The words sounded pathetic to his own ears. The woman tilted her head slightly. "I'm sorry." "How did you do that?" Julian asked, his voice getting louder, tinged with a desperation he didn't try to hide. "I watched you. I heard you. You missed notes. Your timing was off. The technique was, it was amateur. But the sound." He struggled to find the words. "The sound was alive. Mine was dead. How is that possible? I have spent my whole life learning the rules of music. I know the physics of the instrument. I know exactly how hard to hit every key to make it perfect. Why was your imperfect song better than my perfection?" The son stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Hey, she doesn't need to explain anything to you. You had your turn. You had your stage." Julian ignored him. He couldn't take his eyes off the woman. "Please," he said. He wasn't begging for forgiveness, but he was begging for knowledge. "I need to know." The woman looked at her son and gently patted his arm. "It's all right," she said softly. She turned her attention back to Julian. She looked at him with a strange pity in her eyes. It was worse than her anger. It was the look someone gives a starving man who doesn't know how to cook. "Julian," she said. She used his name for the first time. "You play like you are running a race. You are always running to the next note. You are running to the end of the song. You are so worried about being perfect that you forget to listen." She reached out and tapped her own chest, right over her heart. "Music is not in the fingers. The fingers are just the messengers. The music is in here. When I play, I don't think about the black and white keys. I don't think about the rules. I think about the day I lost my job 10 years ago. I think about the day my boy was born. I think about the cold mornings walking to the bus stop. I let those feelings flow out of my heart, down my arms, and into the strings." Julian stared at her. "But, if you do that, you make mistakes. You lose control." "Yes," she said simply. "You lose control of the notes. But you gain control of the feeling. People don't come to hear the notes, Julian. They have notes on their phones. They come to hear feelings. They come to feel less alone in the world. When you played tonight, you showed us how strong you are. You showed us your skills. But when I played, I showed them our pain. And that is something they can hold on to." Julian felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He looked at his hands again. He realized he had spent 30 years treating the piano like a machine to be operated, and she treated it like a living thing to be conversed with. He was a technician, and she was a poet. I don't know how to play that way," Julian admitted, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to let go." The woman smiled. It was a kind smile, but it was also a final one. She stepped past him, gently squeezing his shoulder as she went. "Then maybe it is time to stop playing the piano," she said softly, "and start listening to it instead." She walked away with her son, the sound of their shoes fading into the distance. Julian stood alone in the hallway. The noise of the party seemed miles away. He turned and walked back onto the empty stage. The huge ballroom was dark now, lit only by the exit signs and the ghostly glow of the city lights coming through the high windows. The great black Steinway sat in the center of the floor, looking like a sleeping beast. Julian walked slowly toward it. He sat down on the bench. He didn't open his sheet music. He didn't look at the keys. He closed his eyes. He sat there for a long time, just breathing. He tried to clear his mind of the scales, the arpeggios, the metronome, the judges, the applause. He tried to clear his mind of his own ego. He sat in the silence, feeling the weight of the instrument in front of him. Slowly, tentatively, he lifted one hand. He didn't go for a fast run. He didn't try to impress the empty room. He pressed down a single key. A low, deep A note. He let it ring. He listened to how the sound vibrated through the wood, how it faded into the air. It wasn't a perfect note. It had a slight wobble to it. It sounded real. He thought about the woman's story. He thought about his own life, about the long hours of practice, the loneliness of his apartment, the pressure to always be the best. He felt a sudden wave of sadness for himself. He had missed so much by trying to be perfect. He pressed another key. A C. Then an E. It was a simple chord. He played it slowly. He wasn't thinking about the music theory. He was just playing a sound that felt sad, the way the night felt sad. It wasn't brilliant. It wasn't flashy. It was just a simple progression of notes, played by a man who was finally learning to speak. For the first time in his life, the piano didn't feel like an opponent he had to conquer. It felt like a friend. He played one more chord, let it fade into the dark, and finally, Julian understood.